Welcome! This is another in my Climate Mythbusters series, and the myth I'm going to bust today is that a grand solar minimum will save us from anthropogenic global warming. Well, let's start with the myth conception involved here. 1. That a grand solar minimum is about to happen. 2. That it will last a long time. 3. That it will significantly depress global temperatures. And 4. The resulting cooling will be enough to halt or reverse global warming. None of these statements are true. This whole idea originates from the idea that the last few solar cycles have been in decline. I'd argue they've been in decline since 1957, not 1980. And the assumption here is that this decline will continue. But you've got to look at the bigger picture here. We've had similar declines before, and neither of them have resulted in a grand solar minimum. In fact, if we take a look at the Maunder minimum and the two cycles just prior to it, that's there, you will see that the cycle just before the Maunder minimum was a fairly normal cycle, actually maybe slightly above normal, and the cycle before that was smaller, so there was actually an upward trend in the cycles just before the Maunder minimum. So it seems the trend in solar cycles is not an indicator of whether a grand solar minimum is going to occur. One of the arguments that's often used is that we're due for one. They say that these occur every 400 years. We've got a record here based on isotopes of where people believe a grand solar minimum were before. And you can see that there are about 21 dips in this time record over the last 11,500 years. And that would average out at 537 years between these things. But some of them are less than 100 years apart. Others are over 2,000 years apart. So there's quite a bit of variation here. But if you take the average of 537, that would say our next grand solar minimum isn't due on average until 2187. So it's something that we need to not actually worry about in the foreseeable future. Normally when people talk about the Maunder minimum, they show pictures of snow-covered streets and people getting around on ice skates and sleds. But how much would a grand solar minimum really affect global temperatures? Let's take a look at the total solar irradiance. If we subtract from the average total solar irradiance observed over the last 40 years, that's the green line on this plot, the minimum total solar irradiance that's ever been observed, which is the blue line on this plot. There are the two numbers. So the average here is 1361.1 and the minimum ever seen is 1360.48. The difference between that is 0.62 watts per meter squared, and that would translate to a change in temperature of about 0.48 degrees centigrade at most. If we took the average minimum value for the total solar irradiance, which is the dashed line on here, the value would be about half of that. As they say, the race is not always to the swift nor the battle to the strong, but that's the way to bet. Or another way of putting it, the one who wins the race is the one that keeps running. So who would win? The grand solar minimum or anthropogenic global warming? Well, we can look at some numbers to see. So according to our previous calculation, the Earth could cool by as much as 0.2, maybe as much as 0.5 degrees centigrade if the grand solar minimum is sustained for several decades. The current rate of warming from anthropogenic global warming is about 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade. That would say that grand solar minimum could compensate for at most 10 to 25 years of anthropogenic global warming. That's if the grand solar minimum happens and anthropogenic doesn't accelerate as it's projected to do so. Perhaps past history will help us a little bit to clarify the situation. Well, let's take a look at the Maunder minimum with respect to global temperatures. Here in the plot we see the little ice ages marked in grey, standardly thought to go from 1350 to 1850. So where is the Maunder minimum with respect to that? I've overlaid a little blue line with respect to that, and you can see that global temperatures didn't particularly change during the Maunder minimum. In fact, it's not even the coldest part of the little ice age according to this plot. So it seems that the Maunder minimum, a 70-year period without sunspots, had very little effect on global temperatures. We can take a look at modern data, comparing the size of various solar cycles with global temperatures at that time. I've marked on here the 8 warmest years on record, and you can see they all occurred during relatively low numbers of sunspots. Equally, the highest sunspot cycle seen to date was in 1957, and that corresponds to a dip in global temperatures. So it doesn't seem to be really very well correlated. So let's draw some conclusions from all of this. First of all, a grand solar minimum is unlikely to be in the near future, especially as the indicators that people are using in a historical reference have not worked before. The same people were claiming it was going to happen at the starting in 2010, and of course it didn't. Even if it does happen, we've shown that its impact will be relatively small, if not negligible. So until next time, goodbye.